Hello, everyone. I am feeling all right now. That was great. Thank you guys very much. What are you, last time I was here, David, what did you guys call yourselves? You kind of created a name on the spot. Did
I
you
think
come
it
up
was David and the Bad Habits.
the bad habits?
But I'd kind of like to be included in
Oh, no.
Bad Habits.
Okay.
I
All right,
think
David and the bad habits.
yeah.
Well, let's hear it for David and the bad habits. And I also want to congratulate you for coming back into your practitionership. That is a huge step, and we are always practitioners, and it is good just to acknowledge that. And I find that there is so much strength in practitioners and how we lean into them, and they're so important to a community. So I bless you both for coming back into the fold. So my name is Reverend Jeff Hargis, and it is a thrill for me to be back here once again. They're like, oh, it's going to be a good message. I'm like, oh, don't give me that kind of pressure. I will do my best. So Rumi says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. I know that we have heard that 100 times, but it is just so damn good, isn't it? He goes on to say that when the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, and the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. I can guarantee you that Rumi isn't thinking to himself when he's doing that. If only this other person would come onto the field and start agreeing with my side, then everybody would be living in that perfect place, just as long as I was the one that they were agreeing with. That is absolutely not true. I can guarantee you that Rumi was communing with his own soul to allow himself to release his ego, to surrender into that place where we recognize, where we absolutely know our oneness with each other. That there isn't that illusion of separateness, that we truly are all one. And we can all perceive so many things on this earth right now. I think, Practitioner Sharon, I was hearing you talking about this a couple of weeks ago, about all the things that we were encountering now that is so challenging in our lives, losing our ability to choose, and politics, and all of these other things that we feel like we need to change. And we as religious scientists know from that core place that it is, well, let me rephrase that. We as practitioners, we as religious scientists know when we are grounded that it is not out there that needs to be fixed. It is what is happening within ourselves that truly needs to shift. And that is either individually or collectively. It works in any idea that we're looking at. Einstein says, and we've also heard this 100 times, that we cannot fix the problem at the same conscious level that we created it from. It is an important thing to say because we must change our thinking. We must change our consciousness at that deeper level, our perspective and our very beingness to see the changes in the world. And this just isn't an easy thing to do. And I acknowledge that as a fellow human being on this earth. It is not an easy thing to do. And I know that that Ernest Holmes, the founder of our movement, would often say, turn away from the condition and experience that God quality coming forth. And I will often hear purists speaking to that. And it's not easy. It's a hard thing to do because we were raised with these beliefs and opinions that we have, and we are always fighting for, when we lose ourselves, we fight for that idea of righteousness, don't we? And so that's the title. The title of my talk is kind of in this vein of the battle that is going on within ourselves, of whether or not we decide to sit and argue, or whether or if we choose to surrender and allow things simply to happen. So the title of my talk is The Wise Warrior, and I love the idea of this archetype because it is kind of counter to what we might associate a warrior to be. Yet make absolutely no mistake, it is a battle that happens within ourselves when we are trying to evolve into something bigger and better. And so I'm going to be discussing 3 ideas around here, 3 ways that the wise warrior navigates this path that intersects the human experience with the divine right action. I'm going to speak, number 1, the power of contemplation. David was singing about the silence, and it is that gap between stimulus and response, or better yet, irritant and response, this gap in between these 2 things that is so incredibly important. I'll be speaking to that. Number 2, I'm going to be speaking of it will naturally actually lead us into this idea, the relational power of love, that we are relationship-making beings on this planet. And how do we best prepare ourselves for making and cultivating those loving relationships? And then number 3, and absolutely saving the biggest for last, and that is the wise warrior opens themselves for a higher purpose to unfold. And so the power of contemplation, the Greek philosopher Plotinus said, I do not argue, I contemplate. And as I contemplate, I let fall the seeds of thought into the mirror of mind, which then becomes the mirror of matter. And then Troward says kind of the same thing later on when he says the universe creates by contemplation, and so do we. And so what Plotinus and Troward are speaking of is that powerful time that I was just speaking to, that powerful time between the I've got the attack here. We use the metaphor because we're talking about the warrior, and so I'm going to be using the metaphor of battles and attacks and things like that throughout this, but you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say it. So we are talking about or what Troward is telling us is that there is that reaction time, because what we want to hear, and what we often want to do when we hear an opposition is we want to scream and shout and yell and argue for what is right and wrong. And we get to do that when somebody comes to us with an opposing viewpoint, or somebody else flips us off on the freeway or gives us the bird on the freeway. And we want to do that. The collective consciousness has taught us how to react to this, to communicate our outrage, and like I said, to battle everywhere that we can. And we justify that righteousness by recruiting everybody that we possibly can within earshot to how insane the other person is. The wise warrior within takes a step back, perhaps even a conscious breath, and simply contemplates the situation. We often hear our Christian brothers and sisters ask that question, what would Jesus do? And I know even in my experience, I have a mentor by the name of Reverend Dr. Penny Masick, and I will often ask, what would Penny do in this situation? And one of the easiest things to remember is simply asking the question, what would love do? Because by asking that question for contemplation, we immediately change our own vibration. We immediately change ourselves to that of resistance and defense to one of surrender and opportunity. Even without a clear answer, we are opening ourselves up to an elegant solution that is simple and absolutely positively loving. I remember I used to work at the center in Phoenix called New Vision Center for Spiritual Living. And it was about 3 years ago when I started an email chain with one of our featured artists. And we were going back and forth for a little while, and somewhere along the line, it started to escalate. I felt like she wasn't hearing what I was requesting from her. And things started escalating, and I started getting pissed and started typing in, and saying, this is what we need, and then she would respond in exactly the same way. And here we were at this impasse, unable to resolve the situation. And then finally she replied back to me, and she CC'd my boss, who, by the way, was Reverend Penny. And so I remember seeing that email. I remember seeing the CC and just filling with anger. Just being there and just stretching out my fingers and going, oh, I'm going to respond to this. And then I just took a breath and thought to myself, what would love do in this situation? I don't know if that's a phrase that I use, but I do know that I stepped back and I took a breath. And then Reverend Penny was probably about 20 feet in her office, and I said, when you read the email that is in your inbox, know that I am going to handle this with love. And she said, you got it. It is all yours. And so I responded. I gave it 24 hours, responded back to her, and said, first and foremost, I apologize for the way that I conducted myself. This is not how I want to be. And I would love to have some coffee with you if you have the time. And she responded, absolutely. And so we met, and there was this dialogue that was created around what had happened to me when I started, when I read an email, I was triggered with a lot of fear and about one thing or another, but I did explain exactly what that was. And I kind of put myself in a vulnerable place just to explain to her where I was. And then I wasn't asking for it, but she, in return, responded in the exact same way. It was her very first time singing in front of people, and she was terrified. And I had no idea that that was the case of what was happening with her. And so when she saw sort of my slightly passive-aggressive email, she responded in the same way, and we created this uneasy dialogue. And that was it. It was done. We spent the rest of that coffee just enjoying each other and laughing. And it was done. It was finished. It was never to be brought up again until a little bit later when I was interviewing for her because she has become the new senior minister over in San Jose. And I was just interviewing with her, and she hired me. And I go there in a week and a half. To San Jose as the assistant minister over there. But I brought up that conflict. She's like, I don't even remember. I have no idea what you're talking about. And she had to go back to her email and dig it up. And I said, remember how we resolve conflict. We do really good at it. And so that was a powerful experience for me to when we take that step back to recognize that there is something bigger and more powerful that is willing to reveal itself as long as we are willing to surrender that other stuff. In his book, Yes, You Can Change the World, Amin Matwani invites us to follow a path. The path is an invitation to change how we see the world. We are invited to see the intrinsic worth of every person and every encounter that we have. And this shift alone shifts our interpersonal relationships. And that is what the world is made up of, are these interpersonal relationships. So he invites us into three focus practices. The first one is to focus not on how little time we have, but on how to make the most of what little time we have with every person. And for me, and I made a little note here, presence, presence, presence. Being present with that individual that you are connecting to and seeing that specialness of that person coming out. It means allowing the phone to go into the pocket. It means to listen actively and listen with the heart. And it means, letting go of we sometimes will practice or rehearse what we're going to be saying back to them. It is about being present with that person and loving him just for it is. Focus practice number 2 is focus not on what you see on the outside of a person, but the person within. See both the pain and the potential. And I am absolutely convinced that if we had the power that Spock has, the Vulcan mind belt, that in that moment, I can't remember, it's like here and here or something like that, the moment that we touch and fully understand the dynamics of that individual, we understand their history, their family history, what environment they grew up, what traumas they've experienced in their life, the joys that they have had in their life. When we are coming from that place of acknowledging that individual, it's like when they have an opposing viewpoint to what we believe in deeply, it's like, yeah, I get it. I totally understand why you're coming from that place. So it is a place of empathy and love that we interact with one another. Focus practice number 3 is focus not on what's wrong with a person, but on what makes them right. See their strength within their weakness. And I know that many times in my community, when there was somebody that was when there's somebody that's challenging, I employ the practice of just loving them deeply. And it's part of my morning practice, and it is part of just being with them. And every time I see that person, to lean in and step towards them and just love them right where they are. It is amazing how much they change when you do that. It is amazing how much they change. I'm glad you got that. So the wise warrior knows that it is not just their power that creates real change. This is part of my last point. We talked about that intersection of time, of contemplation, and then we talked about that value of those interpersonal relationships. But I think the most important part of this is that the wise warrior knows that it is not just their power that creates the real change. Are you all familiar with the kingdoms of consciousness? Have you been through that training? It is an amazing teaching. For those of you that have not, think of it in this way. There are quadrants, and there are squares, 4 squares, and each square represents an evolutionary step in our spirituality. And the first step, or the first kingdom, is where life happens to me, and it is very much a place of it's kind of victimhood, where, well, I'm in this place because he or she did this to me, or that situation went south and things just didn't turn out the way that I wanted them to. Kingdom 2, that evolutionary step upward, is life happens by me. It is this point where we understand that being a victim is not working. It doesn't work for us. And so we take life and we take ownership of it. We take ownership of our life and start creating those things in our life, whether that is a spiritual thing or just a thing in spite, just knowing that I am totally in charge of this life and I'm going to make it a good one. And then the area that I want to speak to most of all is this kingdom number 3, and that is where a life happens through me, and that is where we are at today. I will say that just as a sidestep, that 4th quadrant is kind of the Jesus quadrant, and we rarely get to that point. It is often kind of that battle within to remain in this place of the 3, but they call it the blob. The blob kind of goes everywhere along these quadrants. But ultimately, for me anyway, that goal is to be in that place where life is happening through me. And the one thing that I really want to speak to around this is that the thing about this area is that we must be open to things that we weren't expecting to come into our lives. It is so everything that we had intended in our life, well, there may be a different idea that God has for us that may end up in the same place that we had intended, that we had desired, but there may be something new that comes our way. And I want to speak to the story about my father and I. We went to New Orleans when the hurricane hit the Gulf. We met there. He was in California. He was with his Unitarian church, and they went out, and I said, Dad, I would love to join you for that, because there was a calling deep inside me that said, I must go there and fix things. And so we met there. I had a couple of suitcases full of tools, and we got there, and on the very we got to it. It was amazing. We stayed at this really, really old Unitarian church in bunk beds, and it was very it was a very interesting experience. I loved that church. You could just walk through all these different hallways and experience new things. And anyway, I don't know why I went in that direction, but anyway, that very first morning, I was assigned a homeowner that had a lot of damage done in her home. She was on the lower 9th ward, which got hit the worst in this hurricane and the flooding. And so I got to her place, and her name is Mrs. Boyd, and she was a lovely woman. And she sat me down, and she served me breakfast. It was the second breakfast that I'd had that morning, but she insisted on us sitting down and doing that. Mrs. Boyd was an artist, and there was just eclectic artwork everywhere. It was just all over the house, whether it was oil paintings or water paintings, or mobiles, or what do you call the magazine collages. She had all these things everywhere around her house. And the other thing about Mrs. Boyd is that she loved to talk. She loved to talk. And I found myself sitting with her in the kitchen nook, and she just talked on and on and on. And I could feel myself getting anxious about what she was doing, and thinking about all of the work that was there ahead of me, and that she was keeping me from doing my work. And I was getting a little irritated by it, but then finally breakfast kind of ended, and I got up and started heading into a different room, and she followed me everywhere that I went, to talk more about me, to ask me questions. And I found by the end of that day, I really had hardly gotten anything done. And I remember going back to the church, and my dad and I went out and we had a beer together, and we talked about our respective days. And I was telling him, Dad, she kept on talking. I couldn't get any of my work done, and I was bitching and complaining about all that was that was happening there. And he looked at me and he said, "You know, Jeff," which is the sign that I'm going to get some feedback from him. He said, "You know, Jeff, you don't have to finish all the work." And it was a statement that was so simple to me, yet there was such a sense of surrender and opening up to what this could possibly look like. And so the next morning, I skipped breakfast at the church, and I went over to her place, and we sat, and I listened. And it was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had, because she started talking about these stories of the hurricane itself and what she went through. She talked about the flooding. She talked about how the authorities were awful, how they mistreated them. She talked about losing half of her artwork in all of the water. And at the same time, from the kitchen nook, she pointed over to a cabinet. One of the cabinets had a different handle or a pull on it. It was totally different from all the rest. And she said, Bob from Boston saw this hurricane on the news, saw it over and over again. He got in his pickup truck and he just drove. He drove out here and he had this pull and he replaced the one that was missing there. I will never replace that pool. And then the second wave of volunteers that came in, there was a group of people that overheard me saying that I needed more counter space. And they brought a bunch of wood in that they had themselves, and they also gathered from some of the condemned homes that had made piles of trash. And they brought them in, and they built her an island, and it was beautiful in its quaintness. And so here were all of these stories that were being told to me, and it was like this light hit me from above that just said, my God, I am not here to swing a hammer. It's the last thing that I am here to do. I am here to listen to these stories, all of the stories that were coming from me, because there is a sense of somebody coming from outside of this community, coming in and hearing what they had been through. It wasn't enough to see it on the news every day. It was that connection that we have with each person. And with each story that was told to me, I could feel this healing that was starting to generate just with this individual person, and most definitely as a collective of the New Orleans community, certainly in the lower Ninth Ward area. And there's also another element to this around myself and my healing journey, because I recognized that there was something more that I had to do, and I had been very uncontent with where my life was at that point. And there was an opening for me that I didn't know would come to this point where I'd be speaking on a platform, but it was about that connection with people that started opening up for me that was so poignant of an experience. And then every single family or homeowner that I visited after there, I had the same significant story happen. And, you know, I didn't waste the first day of going, they're talking too much. And it was just listening to these stories, and one after another, it was special and deep and just a loving experience. Max Dupree says, the greatest thing is, at any moment, to be willing to give up who we are in order to become all that we can be. The wise warrior archetype picks and chooses his or her battles carefully, and 100% of the time, it is not a physical battle. It is the choice to look at things from a different perspective, a different level of consciousness, whether it is giving that gap of time between the stimulus and our response, or whether it is engaging our fellow human beings from that loving place of empathy and joy, or whether it is hearing loud and clear that the universe is conspiring for our good and listening to it. So that is what I have to say today, and I would love to bring that into prayer. And so we just take that moment, the moment of the breath, recognizing that there is nothing but the presence of God, of Spirit, of the infinite one that is here and now, that we do not have to go anywhere to experience the vastness, the bigness, the love of God. And so it is from this place that I speak a word into all that has unfolded here today, into this loving, joyous community, into simply our day. Knowing that as we step forward into our own journeys, we do so from that wise warrior standpoint, a place of ease and surrender, a place of joy and connection, a place of knowing the oneness of us all. I recognize that there is truly love here, and it cannot be avoided. And I celebrate with this beautiful community and dwell in that place of absolute gratitude for all that has unfolded, for where this community is, and for the joy that life is working through us at all times. And so I release this into that universal knowing and strength and wisdom, knowing that it is done, knowing that I need do nothing else. I allow it to be, and I call it so good. And together we know this truth by saying together, and so it is.